is co-chairing that meeting this morning. So it's a joint meeting of DROIT and LIBE. We have also invited AFET colleagues, development colleagues, SEDE colleagues, so that we have a broad spectrum of political responsibilities in this room, but also online. It's my pleasure to welcome Volker Türk this morning and colleagues. We have the honor to welcome with Volker Türk, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's crucial to have an open exchange with him. We congratulate him for his excellent work and for his start in this position, which he started last year. But on the other hand, it's critical enough to have this exchange because, colleagues, you know yourself how critical the situation of human rights in this world is and became. We know that more than 1 in 4 children in poor countries is involved in child labor. We know that more than 100 million people on the globe are forcibly displaced and have to look for new places, new homes, for new bases to feed their family. We have the situation worsening for civic society organizations. We speak of shrinking spaces, and we see the attack on the free press, on journalists, go so far that more than 50 journalists recently were killed. The world needs journalists more than ever, but it comes not by accident that exactly this profession is in the focus of the autocrats. This is not the only problem that we have to deal with, because besides the real politics development, we also see that the narrative is under attack. The narrative of human rights as a indivisible, as a universal concept, and this in the year where we would like to celebrate, which will be due in November here with a high-level conference, the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. So there is issues enough to have a critical conversation on the subject. The committees involved concentrate on the defense of human rights and permanently try to live up to the obligation of the European Union, which is clearly documented in Article 21 of the Treaty of the European Union, where the European Union is obliged not only to defend human rights, but also support human rights with all their actions, in all their negotiations, in all their policy fields, in all the treaties that we also agree with third countries. So now let me give the floor to Andrzej for his introductory remarks, and then we are looking forward to the exchange with Volker Türk.
Thank you, Udo. Very shortly, I would like to welcome you in LIBE committee name. LIBE means the committee very focused on civil liberties, human rights, justice, and home affairs. It's very important that we have this common meeting together because both committees, DROIT and LIBE, are very focused on human rights protection, also within European Union, our commonwealth, but also outside. We are facing many challenges with migration, with asylum policy. You know very well how important it is also in these days. I have one additional technical remark for our colleagues. We have translation in 12 languages, German, English, French, Italian, Dutch, Greek, Spanish, Portuguese, Swedish, Hungarian, Polish, and Romanian. I hope it will be enough for everybody and useful. Also, well, let's start the meeting because it's very important. We have limited time for the meeting. Very happy to see High Commissioner with us, Volker Türk, the first time, but not the last time, I hope. Let's not to prolong because the summer holidays are coming, so everybody is thinking about the planes. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrzej. The floor is to Volker Türk. I welcome also Christina Kokinakis here on the podium for the External Action Service, who will also address us right after the introductory remarks of Volker Türk. Please, you have the floor.
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be back in Brussels. It's actually I have had a couple of meetings with parliamentary committees in my previous incarnation when I worked for UNHCR, but it's great to be able to do it and to have an exchange of view with yourselves as in my new function as High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it's actually, when you come through this Espace Leopold, there's one thing that always strikes me. It's this sense of the institutions that we represent. Well, they didn't really exist a human lifetime ago. And it actually shows how important it is that this common sense of values that they represent, the United Nations and the European Union, actually underpins everything that we do. And I think it's important to sometimes remember it, especially when we have these anniversaries. And both institutions were built as an act of courage and defiance in the face upon war, upon war, upon war, about atrocity crimes, genocide, and generations also of exploitation and pain. And the United Nations, as well as the European Union, were really built as an act of hope and a commitment to profound and enduring principles. And the acts that manifested themselves, the acts that manifested the values that 75 years ago our forebears set out to mark a new path to peace, justice, shared prosperity for all human beings, is best encapsulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, because the drafters at the time, when they adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they didn't think that there was time for idealism. They really forged these commitments as practical solutions to the problems that the world faced coming out of the Second World War. And we know that these tools have worked. Let's not forget this. We have seen over the past 75 years, and it's important to be aware of the achievements, that the world, Europe, have made great strides away from colonial exploitation, from discrimination of every kind, and many other types of injustices. So nobody could claim that this progress has been perfect. Nobody is perfect. But it is clear that much of it, of the progress that we have achieved, has been guided by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the subsequent human rights treaties that we have seen over the last couple of decades. And let's also not forget the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the most translated document on earth. Some would think it's different texts, but it's actually the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As a result, we are in the Guinness Book of Records. As we approach this anniversary this year, we are also approaching we are approaching a kind of crossroads. We have seen this conjunction of multiple crises that we are all dealing with, and the immense significance that it has. So our choice is to act or not to act with careful determination and in line with these deep-seated values and shared values will alter many aspects of politics, of economy and society across Europe and the world. We have seen how Europe continues to lead the development of careful regulation on digital technologies, especially in light of the intense acceleration that we see with generative AI and so forth. We also know how these, in some instances, have unfortunately led to echo chambers and extremist movements, especially when it comes to social media platforms. And we also see the challenges that they mean to privacy, truth, equality, free speech, but also democratic institutions. So it's clear that we will have to deal with them, and Europe has led the way in many respects. But we also know that the digital technologies are absolutely important, especially in the green transition, to ensure that we find the type of tools that we need in order to be able to confront these challenges. Russia's war on Ukraine continues to threaten the world's peace architecture. I have to say that. It tugs multilateral and regional institutions back to blocs and to hostile standoffs, just at a time when we need to forge consensus solutions for problems that are too big for any country or for any region to face alone. We also know climate change is out of control. It's a triple planetary crisis is threatening all of humanity. There are human rights implications in each and every aspect of that. And I want to really acknowledge the efforts of the European Union on the green transition and on climate change more broadly. But we also know that a lot of more work needs to be done to stop the subsidizing of the fossil fuel industry before they turn all human beings into fossils. So that's a very, very important call to make. Unfortunately, we have also seen more conflicts breaking out. I mean, the last one is Sudan. We also see how there is this interrelationship between environmental degradation, climate change, fueling of conflicts, competition over scarce resources. And in fact, Sudan demonstrates how fragile peace is and how quickly hard-won gains can be lost. Next week, I will go to Chad to give you an example where, as you have seen already, over 100 refugees from Sudan, especially from Darfur, have arrived. And they already suffer from the massive climate change impacts and violent extremism that we see. You have just come back from New York on the Sustainable Development Agenda. We know how derailed that agenda has been, not least because of COVID, but also because of many other reasons. Because also of the sharp economic and social inequalities that we see around the world, including with different parts of different middle-income countries, but lower-income countries in particular. They have, I mean, if you look at some of the statistics, World Food Programme estimates that more than 345 million people will face high levels of food insecurity this year, more than double the number that we had in 2020. And of course, the conflict, I mean, the war against Ukraine, the climate change are really some of the major drivers behind global hunger. The movement of migrants and refugees is clearly related to this dismal state of affairs when it comes especially to conflict, economic inequalities and social inequalities and so forth. But it has to be said, most displacement occurs within countries. We're talking here about internally displaced people, mostly in the poorest regions of the world. And I welcome very much the fact that the European Union member states have received over 4 million Ukrainian refugees. But I've also watched with great concern how polarized and fraught with emotion the debate has become also in Europe about migration and refugee protection in Europe. Because it deepens, unfortunately, some of the political divisions that we see. It also fuels sometimes populist hostility rather than what I think is necessary, a much needed evidence-based, fact-based, rational debate that actually helps us find solutions. I mean, when in my previous position, I dealt a lot with the so-called previous Australia models, of deterring arrivals and transferring people who are seeking safety to third countries. Of course, this has raised huge human rights concerns. It has actually also been a great cost to taxpayers. I mean, if you look at it from that perspective as well. And we also see it's not viable. Because what we need is actually functioning asylum systems and robust immigration, especially when we see that birth rates are declining. We have seen in many countries around the world on another issue, including sometimes also in the EU, some backsliding on some key fundamental human rights commitments. It's important to support as much as possible the widest possible civic space, innovation and creativity to be able to deal with the big challenges of our times are not coming with repression of civic space. They will only work if you allow innovation and creativity to take place. It's also about upholding the principles of equality and non-discrimination. And we have seen, unfortunately, a backlash against women's rights, reproductive health and rights, the rights of LGBTIQ+ people. And we really need to make sure that there is a much stronger work also against racism and to uphold the work and the equality of people of African descent and migrants. We have, and I'm very much confronted with it on a daily basis, frankly, some of the political tension, geopolitical tensions, but also the geo-economic backdrop to human rights has been quite something over the last couple of years. But we also know that human rights is the compass that navigates us through troubled times. And it's true that the Universal Declaration was precisely intended at a time when the world was in turmoil and in chaos to provide a guide forward in order to find solutions to the problems that we all face. Human rights begin at home. They are not an annex to foreign policy or to geopolitics of any kind, an annex at all. They must be at the core of legislation at the national and the EU level, and I'm glad that there are these two committees that meet together on this, because it is really also about that. And we also know, and that's a particular point that I want to emphasize, when it comes to human rights economy, we have launched this concept of a human rights economy because we need to look at economic and fiscal policies from the perspective and regulation of businesses from the perspective of human rights. And you are demonstrating this with the human rights safeguards, especially in supply chains. And we need to make sure that at the core of all decisions, at the core of all behaviors made by public servants in every country, including teachers, police forces, and coast guards, that indeed there is an awareness and a mindfulness of the human rights dimension. As members of key committees of the world's largest democratically elected parliament, you are human rights actors. There's no doubt about this. And I encourage you, especially in this anniversary year, to make one or several pledges to take action that can catalyze positive change and transformative change in human rights as we look to the future. We have a big high-level event coming up in Geneva on the 11th and 12th December, and we can share information with you about this. But we hope that we can develop a pledging tree to actually look to the future with the type of things that we can all commit to on the human rights front, so that human rights is not becoming the collateral damage of geopolitics. So very much thank you for all the work that you have been doing, all the support that we get from you as a donor, as a political, as a strategic partner. And, you know, hopefully we can work together on many fronts. And I would like to thank you in particular as parliamentarians for being such steadfast supporters of my office and of the human rights cause at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. Christina, if it's okay for you, we go around the colleagues on the floor. Andrzej and myself will invite them to take the floor, and you come in and have also the capacity then to comment directly also to what colleagues have said. Because Volker Türk was mentioning inequalities and the performance of the European Union, let me only report back from the high-level political forum in New York, where the first review of European Union achievements on the SDGs was presented by Commissioner Gentiloni as well as by Commissioner Urpilainen. Jutta Urpilainen took the floor especially on the external dimension of our activities, and she put on the highest point of her agenda the fight against inequalities, also introducing the new methodology of inequality marker that she had already presented in Paris, in the conference in Paris recently, where we, as European Union, would like to assess what we are doing to guide and to improve the effectiveness of our collaboration to work forward with SDG 10 especially. So, having said that, we enter into the dialogue with the colleagues, and Isabel Wiesler for the PPE is our first speaker.
Thank you so much for being with us and for everything you said. It's important. I'm sorry. Okay. Je vais continuer en français.
I'm going to continue in French. I just wanted to stress a couple of points that you raised. And that is the focus on the dignity of every human being, the freedom to be who you are, to believe or not to believe. These are integral parts of a person, but which are sometimes overlooked. When I focus on this issue, I think we also have to defend democracy. Authoritarian regimes decide for people what they should be, what they should think. And that is dangerous for human dignity. I also think it's important that we be aware that authoritarian regimes act beyond their own borders. Their goal is also to destroy our democracies. Their influence is stronger, and they have means available to them that are different to those available in the past. Propaganda and disinformation have developed, are used by authoritarian regimes, and they are now a great threat to democracy and therefore to human rights. I just wanted to highlight that. Yes, progress has been made, you mentioned that, but there is backsliding today because of the globalization of means of communication. Human rights are under threat as a result. So I just wanted to raise that point. I hope that we can dialogue in these issues, that you'll pick up this point. Thank you for being with us, and I hope we see you again at the end of the year for the anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's a time for Libe Committee representation from EPP side also. Caroline Braunsberger and Reinhold, please. The floor is yours for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much for being here. Sorry, I wasn't prepared to talk, but
I have the name registered.
It's great to have you being here. You talked about you had a lot of points, and like you said, we witness a throwback in some of human rights, and women rights and LGBTQI rights, and sometimes I'm very concerned that we move backwards more than forwards, and I think that we have to fight these rollbacks. I'm sorry, I don't have a better word for this. And that we have to fight these extreme points, whether one extreme point and the other extreme point, because we had a lot of good, we walked a lot forward in the last centuries we can say, and I think we have to maintain this going forward. And at the moment, we have this climate crisis. We have these wars all over our world. We have this war we can say in Europe, but we say that it affects us more than we thought in the first point. So I hope that we can find a way to work together again, that we can move forward again, and that we fight this extremism on both ends of the extreme points. So thank you for being here to talk with us at this very point when we don't have to forget to talk about it and to talk together and find solutions together. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dietmar Köster, Socialists and Democrats.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, High Commissioner, for your presentation and having this opportunity for an exchange of view. I would like to raise 3 concrete issues. My first one is, as you know, NGOs and human rights activists have been harshly criticizing the so-called Libyan Coast Guard for years for its human rights violations. However, the EU supports them financially and cooperates with them. In March, the United Nations published a report stating that the EU supports and incites crimes against humanity by funding the Libyan Coast Guard. From your perspective, what should be the reaction of the EU to these findings? Would you agree that the EU should immediately stop cooperating with an authority which is causing murders, rapes, enslavement, judicial killings, and forced disappearances? And do you see similar dangerous developments when the EU concludes agreements like the recent one with Tunisia? My second issue is, it refers to the right of conscientious objection to military service. Especially in the context of the current Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, we can see that many Russian, but also Ukrainian men do not want to participate in the war which is against international law. But there are almost no legal entry routes for them to seek asylum in the EU. However, conscientious objection is a human right. What concrete actions should the EU take in order to support conscientious objectors, and how can the EU and the UN cooperate in that matter? And my last issue is the fact that we must really regret the non-extension of the Black Sea grain agreement between Ukraine and Russia. I think this will have severe impact on the food security. It will be in danger. And so I would like to ask you, could the UN do more to put it again on the political agenda, that we can proceed in this way? And do you think it would be a good idea that the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres himself, would visit Moscow, Mr. Putin, together with other representatives of the important states of the Global South, to achieve some progress in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Matthias Nemetz, also S&D Group, but from Libe Committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm here also as a chairman of the Maghreb delegation. As you know, all the 5 countries are quite well involved also in our thoughts because of the situation in the last period. We are more focused on the Tunisian events, and of course, all the region is facing tough times. And our position is that we have to co-work with them. Actually, we are facing tough situation in Libya, in Algeria, and in Morocco, and sometimes we are adopting an ad hoc resolution, which are not having a good impact in a bilateral, in a bilateral relations. So we have to take account that we have many bodies in the European Parliament, involving themselves in the internal and bilateral issues. So sometimes this is also it was my proposal to the House of the Parliament. We have to be a little bit more aligned, and not just the European Parliament bodies, but even with all European institutions. As you know, we are really critical regarding the new events, especially in Tunisia, in the approach of the European Commission regarding those issues. There are different views, and we have many questions regarding the Tunisian issue. But we are here to defend, of course, the values of the human rights, and you are more than welcome today to being part of this debate. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Charles Goerens from Renew.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais...
Thank you, Chairman. In turn, I'd like to welcome Mr. Türk amongst us. I agree with the points made. I have the following points. When it comes to the issue of human rights, you'll only find people in favour in this Parliament, except for a few sad exceptions. The issue is implementing human rights, which is not the same thing. It gets more complicated when it comes to persuading our allies and partners or our opponents that they should deliver on what is put into very often the preamble of trade agreements and so on. We very often insist on the following classic scheme. Political representatives in a country, let's say China, negotiate economic agreements, and there's a press agreement, a press conference in which we're declared to be partners. But then a little later on in the same place, the foreign affairs ministers will be greeted with abuse in the same country. So it's as if there's a division of labour between the two in the same place. But that doesn't work, and that's why I would be in favour of a different approach, not an exclusive one that rules out all the other attempts that you are discussing, but a complementary approach. It's not for the first time that in my rare appearances here I've pleaded in favour of confidential diplomacy. I think we can progress on a number of points more swiftly if we took our inspiration from the benefits of these policies. We don't want our interlocutors to lose face, from whom we want human rights concessions. They'll never do that in front of a camera, but they might do it in a room where they are sheltered from the public gaze. And now, without generalising on these cases, I think we can make progress step by step. And step by step, I think we can achieve success. And the major advantage is that this is not in the public eye. The Uyghurs imprisoned or those saved from the death penalty will not be given visibility from such agreements. But that is vital. So I'd like to know whether in your position you are in a position to construct a network of diplomats who can get things going behind the scenes in some way.
Greens.
Thank you, and I will for once speak in German today. Schön, dass Sie hier sind.
Nice to see you here. And even nicer that we've had your institution for 75 years. I'm sometimes surprised by how many people in repressive regimes are helped out by the fact that their cases are brought up in your reports, and I think it's all the more important for us to see that. It might be religion or other reasons that benefit from an institution that shows that our common values and common conventions are upheld. And I think it's never fully achieved, but I think it's excellent that we've had this institution for 75 years now. Against that background, personally, I'm in favour of universal periodic reviews because I think it provides an appropriate level way of flagging up whether certain conventions are abided by or whether there's a need for improvement. what I'm a little troubled by, and I can certainly agree with previous speakers, is that we, the European Union, or the member state, criticise other countries very strongly, but then go on to have political relationships or agreements with those countries, and that criticism falls by the wayside. This might be exemplified by Tunisia, for example, where there's been a lot of criticism on human rights, but then a €1 billion agreement was signed, and similar things apply to Egypt. The question is, how do we try and plug those loopholes and give the process more credibility? A couple of very specific comments from me. Firstly, the Iran fact-finding mission, which fortunately is picking up pace and carrying out its investigations. Some individual regimes turn this down. There's a lot of pressure exerted when there's cooperation with UN missions. Now, we have to think about how we can help people with temporary reception or asylum and so on. Do you feel that EU member states are doing enough, or do you sometimes find yourself wishing that our contribution is more strongly held up by the institutions, and it's not simply a question of financial transfers? Then human rights defenders, and when we mark the anniversary in the autumn, we need to think about how we breathe life into this agreement, to this convention. So it's not just on paper, but we really do specifically help people, protect people. How do we help these human rights defenders? I don't think we do enough at the moment. Now, the protective feature could be visas or asylum, allowing them to network in conferences and so on. Sometimes they're forced into exile for many years. The Human Rights Convention, marking its 75 years, is a response to the dreadful events of the Second World War. And I think political asylum is as well. Now, even the conservatives are questioning this in Germany. And that shakes me to my core. Human rights isn't just for the sunny times, it's also for when you're in a real crisis. And when people are in a crisis, when people are attacking it is something that bothers me. You've talked about the pledging tree you want to see. You've talked about that with respect to December. I hope there's a strong commitment on visas for human rights defenders when they need it, and on political asylum as a simple way of delivering our commitments under the UN system and protecting human rights. That's something that the European Union could do.
You use double time, but there is additional 2 minutes for Greens. Coordinator from LIBE Committee, Tineke Streek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you both chairs, but thanks a lot, Mr. Türk, for being here and giving us a chance to jointly celebrate the anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration. And I have a question that combines actually your previous and your current function, namely the human rights of refugees, because they are, as you also said, under increasing pressure. You mentioned briefly the Australian model, but I must say that the EU's tendency to externalize and deter migrants and refugees is going more and more into that direction. And talking about evidence-based policies, which you mentioned, I'm very grateful for the fact-finding mission report that the UN came up with in March on the situation of Libya, where the UN clearly stated and concluded that the Directorate for Combating Illegal Migration, Stability Support Apparatus, but also the Libyan Coast Guard, are actively and deeply involved in crimes against humanity, including smuggling and trafficking, torture, slavery, sexual exploitation, as also my colleague Dietmar Kuster already mentioned. But your conclusion was also that the EU contributes to these crimes against humanity through its significant financial support of the Libyan Coast Guard. And I must say, I thought it would be explosive news, it would be a bomb, but it was extremely silent afterwards. There was a human rights resolution afterwards, also adopted by the EU, not mentioning these devastating conclusions, but only asking to transfer the monitoring to the Libyan authorities, which is very cynical, of course, and only mention some things on technical assistance. So since then, we really try to get clarity how the EU reflects on this, if it's reviewing its policy, if anything has happened since then. And I must say, I'm going against walls in the EU. So I really would like to know from you, more on one side, what are you doing now as a follow-up to that report and the lack of response from the EU? But what strategies would you see as allies in human rights that we could jointly do in order to increase the attention and change policies? Wouldn't you think that funding at least should be made conditional on fundamental rights compliance, and that a monitoring system would need to be established, which is transparent and independent? And that brings me to my last question, because UN clearly urged for continuing its monitoring mission in Libya. What is the state of play of that? Is there a need for more funding? Because I understand the mandate has not been prolonged. And what could we do in order to make sure that you can keep on your important work there? Thank you.
Thank you. Tineke spoke about the silence in the reaction to the UN reports. Our committees have not been silent, but silence comes also as a result of the fact that the respective commissioner do not react to the invitation of our committees, which will not lead to the fact that we will become silent. Quite the opposite, we will become louder and louder. Next speaker is Mick Wallace for the left group, and afterwards we take the freedom to go back to Volker Türk, because he has already taken notes and notes and notes, and we then open for a second round, if that is okay. You are okay? Then we continue without a break, and all the colleagues who have raised their hand will speak. But now it's Mick.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks very much for your presentation. You made the point that the Ukraine war and the climate crisis are two of the main drivers of the food crisis. But a United Nations report, which was published only last week, the state of food security and nutrition in the world in 2023, the report actually makes the point that the war in Ukraine has driven 23 million people into hunger, a number that pales in comparison to the other drivers of hunger, such as the impact of commercialised food markets. Financial speculators, it says, now dominate the food market, holding over 60% of some markets compared to 12% 15 years ago. And the report goes on to say, while there are indeed food shortages, the current food crisis is a price crisis rather than a supply crisis. The leading cause, as even the European Economic and Social Committee agrees, is financial speculation in food markets. Now, my second point, on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the Russians have been claiming that the UN and Turkey have failed to fulfil parts of the agreement that would have allowed the easy export of Russian grain and agricultural products, which have been affected due to the sanctions imposed by the US and the EU. I just wonder, what do you think of that? And there's also reports that, according to UN data, grain from Ukraine has been supplied to 45 countries since the deal was formed, but only 12% of it went to Africa and 40% of it went to the rich countries of Europe. I would like for your comment on that. And my last point, I noticed that Kenneth Roth reckons you were the wrong man for the job. So I kind of figured to myself, well, there must be something good about you, because I think if he thinks you're the wrong man, you probably are the right fella. And I was glad to see that you're prepared to focus on the social end of human rights, about the right to health, housing, and whatever, because we drifted away from that a bit. And Kenneth Roth seems to have a problem with that, but I commend you for that approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas Kubilius.
Well, thanks a lot, Chairman. Since I'm not a member either of DROA or LIBE, so I appreciate very much for possibility to participate and to ask the question, especially that I wrote a small letter, on very specific and very important report from High Commissioner of Human Rights to the committee asking to have special discussion on that. And this is, Mr. High Commissioner, really, I praise your report, which you published earlier in March, perhaps this year, which is called Situation of Human Rights in Belarus in the run-up to the 2020 presidential elections and in its aftermath. I simply want to quote, several statements, because this is the first time, at least one I hear in this region, in Belarus and Russia, when on such a level as High Commission on Human Rights, the report speaks very clearly about abuses against the opposition, against civil society. We know the facts. We were witnessing all of us, but with a very clear legal language that some of those, crimes are coming up to the crime against humanity, which means that, then international justice have a possibility and responsibility to react, including with the tribunals. So my question is, High Commissioner, how you foresee what should be done next, including by, political community of European Union, by legal communities, and so on and so on. Because really it's not enough just to react with our statements of concern and so on about what is happening in Belarus, and what the regime is doing, and we know very well, hundreds and thousands of people are suffering in the prisons. Some of them are dying. Recently, again, one of the very well-known leaders, artists, died in the prison, and that is really where I see the way with your job, with your report, to move forward. My second part of the question, very short. Can you imagine that similar report could be done on human rights violation against opposition people and civil, society people in Russia? Where we know again, a lot of families, Navalny, Karamurza, and so on, but, we do not have proper legal instruments to move against the regime when they are violating human rights domestically. We know what to do with the crime against, a crime of war aggression against Ukraine. But how to stop, the war against its own nation, that's what we see as really big issue.
Thank you very much. The High Commissioner has a huge and impressive capacity to take notes, so we continue. And our next speaker is Carlos Sereno, S&D.
Thank you very much. I will use my mother language, so I invite you to use their interpretation devices. I don't know if the Commissioner understands Portuguese. To speak with the Secretary General could be useful. Thank you very much. Senhor Alto Comissário, muito bem-vindo ao Parlamento Europeu. Como relator,
Commissioner, welcome to the European Parliament. As the EP rapporteur for the humanitarian situation, I would like to concentrate on the situation of human rights. There's a humanitarian crisis globally. The number of those needing help is constantly on the rise. Resources are becoming ever more scant. In your recently tabled in its most recent report, the Parliament calls for a humanitarian strategy that is commensurate with the task, and it's important that ecosystems for humanitarian aid is created. The situation on the ground needs to be better known. It's important that the players providing humanitarian assistance know the needs and can integrate properly. The current resources are not enough. They need to be more efficient. We need to reach out to more people. We need to solve situations better. The United Nations is the prime mover in humanitarian assistance and is a key actor in ensuring that we can get a grip on the current challenges. I said that we need to think globally and and act locally, and so I'd like to ask the following question. How do you regard the role of the UN agencies in coordinating this ecosystem that will need to be more resilient on the ground. Should the local agencies and actors not be strengthened? What are you planning to do to strengthen that, to ensure that we can act globally and be resilient locally? Thank you.
Obrigado. Our next colleague is Jordi Canas for Renew.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to take the floor at today's meeting. As the High Commissioner was saying, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has never been more called into doubt than at this time, based on the principles, not on its enforcement. And there are serious threats, not just in the implementation of these rights, but perhaps now there is a significant threat to the principles, to these universal values in the Declaration. People are calling into question the universal nature of these rights. And this is perhaps, so the Declaration is more under threat than ever. Now, I'd perhaps like to focus on a more specific, localized matter. From my analysis of electoral processes on election observation missions, for example, we have seen in recent years deterioration in countries with formal democracies on fundamental basic rights based on Article 21, participation in democracy, for example. And there's persecution of journalists, attacks on human rights defenders, environmentalists. But often there are formal mechanisms against being voted and being elected and voting. Now, this phenomenon is increasing in certain areas of the world, in Latin America, for example, where these tools, legal tools, are being used to attack fundamental rights that are recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also civil and political rights. And when we have such specific situations that are so obvious, I haven't seen a positioning of the United Nations and the human rights, UNHCR. And I really thought you have, when I was listening to the colleagues, I thought you have a mammoth task. You look at all of the situations around the world with threats, violations of human rights, it really is infinite. And it's very difficult to find a solution to such complex situations. But there are some things that are in our hands, and there are things that we can perhaps do. And this is where I think that your work is particularly relevant. Now, I think that it's important for the High Commissioner and your office to be closer to these processes, because I think that we can avoid them happening, prevent them happening. Thank you.
Gracias, Ronnie. Next speaker is Vice President of the European Parliament, Heidi Hautala.
Thank you very much. Mr. Türk, I saw that delightfully the Human Rights Council had a debate on the deplorable situation of Myanmar, which has suffered incredible human rights consequences and repression of the people by the military for already 2.5 years, is it? And I would like to ask you what your sort of key observations for what the international community could do to stop this military coup and support the democratic forces, which also is defense of human rights. You also paid attention to the situation of the 1 million Rohingya refugees. You reminded us that it is the largest refugee camp in the world with 1 million people in Bangladesh. And by the way, I'm aware that the EU Special Representative of Human Rights, Eamon Gilmore, is supposed to be there right now this week to acquaint himself with the situation. A second point I'd like to make that I thank you for your notion of human rights economy. I think it's very important that we understand that there will be no solutions to the global challenges we face with such huge inequalities, climate crisis, etc., unless the solutions are human rights based. And I know that you have paid quite a lot of attention to the sort of business and human rights track of the UN and the solutions, and you're very well aware, I believe, that in the EU at the moment we are legislating on those issues. So perhaps you could say a couple of words about how you see the importance of this business and human rights framework. And is there a chance to come to some sort of global standard on this? There is an intergovernmental working group in Geneva, and we are just starting as a DROA committee to start a report on how the EU could relate to this process, which it has kept its distance to so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Our next speaker is David Leger, PPE.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner, for having this exchange of views with us today. I would like to hear your views on the Iranian regime and the crackdown of the ongoing revolution and peaceful protests of the women of Iran. I mean, today we see increased violence by IRGC and the morality police, and also even more enforcement again to wear the hijab. So just for your information, I just asked today my colleagues for their support in my nomination today for Mahsa Amini and the women of Iran for the Sakharov Prize. I hope for my colleagues' support in that one. But my question is also about the UN Human Rights Council appointed Iran to chair the 2023 Social Forum, which is for me completely incredible, horrible. Iran, I mean, we're talking about a country that executes their own people simply for criticizing religion on social media. And we sent a letter together, I sent a letter together with 30 of my colleagues criticizing this to Václav Bálek. We didn't get any response for that. But how is this affecting your work? That OHCHR is legitimizing the Iranian regime at the same time as your mission is to scrutinize HR abuses. Thank you.
Thanks, David. This very important question. Carsten Lucke, SND.
Vielen Dank, Udo. I'm also going to speak in German.
Thank you. Let me try and simplify things. So let's split between the West and the South, particularly since the 24th of February last year, where the geopolitical plates are shifting. The EU is looking for new partnerships. Now, you said that human rights shouldn't become an annex. I think you're preaching to the converted here, of course, but if I look outside this house, then in reality, there are a lot of countries that are a long way from being sound democracies, and will then have more partners for economic support and who are ready to leap into the breach. And where this narrative might appear, we always hear from people, well, the Europeans always turn up with this annex. And that might be a problem, and they can get support from someone else without the annex. Now, of course, I've simplified the picture. But we want partnerships which we can drive forward. I mean, we have to factor in the fact that these countries have different histories, different cultures, they're young countries. That all has to be taken into account. so that we can take a decision on how we build up the partnership without undermining our deep-seated support for human rights and media freedom. So how do you see this middle road that we have to go down, that split between the 2 points? Thank you.
Soleil for the Greens, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Dear High Commissioner, I would like to bring into our discussion the issue of minority rights. The rights of minorities, including the rights of national minorities, ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples, are still being called into question across the world. Some national minorities are victims of human rights violations. Many interstate conflicts unfold mainly because of discrimination and human rights violations against specific groups, minority groups, and some of these conflicts have led and are still leading to terrible atrocities. So my question is, how is your office approaching the protection of minorities, being them national, ethnic, or indigenous peoples? Thank you.
Thank you, Jordi. On procedures, I will now give the floor to Leopoldo Lopez-Gil for the PPE. Then we have a colleague, Munir Sartori, online, and then I ask Christina Kokinakis to address us from the External Action Service, and Volker can take the time to reconcentrate on all the magnificent contributions from our side. Leopoldo.
Thank you. And thank you, High Commissioner, for coming. Definitely, it's a good cause to celebrate the signing of a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I was impressed by your Shakespearean introduction on the decision to act or not to act on human rights. Yes, definitely some of the world decided to act, and we signed. But I would ask you, does acting necessarily have another question? How to act? And there I seem to find great contradictions. So far we have, at least to my understanding, only 2 ways to act. Either through sanctions or through creation of criminal courts, international criminal courts, which, by the way, not all the signatures that we have on the universal rights are on the same paper with the criminal courts, as you well know. Now, my question is very simple. In your view, which is a better way, a practical way, to right the wrongs of the world in human rights violations? Because we seem, at least, and we have a very unfortunate sample of the European Union, that if we sanction countries or people in the Union, some of the member states do not respect that. And they do just people who are sanctioned go freely on territories of the Union. The same thing happens in the United Nations, I imagine. So, is there a way of being practical to impose and right the wrongs? Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Leopoldo, now we ask Munir Sartori is connected with us.
Oui, vous m'entendez?
Perfect. You have the floor.
D'abord, merci.
Well, first of all, thank you, High Commissioner, for being with us. The work that you do is absolutely crucial where human rights are being abused more and more. the special procedures and the treaties are still very important. My first question is migration. The member states of the EU are refusing to ratify the UN Convention on Migrants' Rights. The UN has published a report suggesting that EU financing is complicit in crimes committed by the Libyan Coast Guard. What do you think of the recent agreement between the EU and Tunisia, where the treating with migrants is essentially outsources? And do you think this is going to have a negative impact on the right of migrants? I'd also like to ask you about your report on businesses and migration. Trade and human rights lines are moving in Europe. We hope there'll be a regulation on this, but the EU's been rather passive when it comes to negotiations on the latest UN instrument, that legally binding instrument on human rights between enterprises and migrants. So we're going to be discussing this in our committee, but I wonder what you feel of the EU's point of view on this crucial instrument and the negotiations on it. How are we going to make sure that all countries, including in the north, constructively engage with this process? I've supported the families that have tried to get French children back from prison camps in Syria. The UN has condemned France's attitude. There are 100 children concerned. I wonder if you could give us your view on that particular situation as well. Thank you.
And now we give the floor to Christina Kokinakis. She is the Deputy Managing Director on Values and Multilateral Relations in the External Action Service. Please, Christina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome also to the other chair of the other committee, and of course to the UN High Commissioner from the side of also of the External Action Service. It's a privilege to have you here today. It's a first exchange the European Parliament has with you, and from the side of the External Action Service, where we prepared your visit during the last weeks and even months together with my own team. We are very happy to have you here, and we feel privileged to have this exchange. I will try to put forward a couple of points, also in the relation, especially in the relation to UDHR 75, to this year, where at least two big human rights anniversaries coincide, UDHR, but also 30 years of the VDPA, of the Vienna Declaration Program of Action. The latter, those who are younger than at least I might maybe not remember, there was a time where there was no office of the United Nations High Commissioner for us, for the international community, and the VDPA established the office. So this is why it's a relevant milestone for us. So concentrating on this year of, I would call a year of opportunities rather than of challenges. Of course, being aware of all the challenges we are facing, the pushback when it comes to universality, indivisibility, and interdependence of human rights. We are fully committed to push back on the pushback, together with the UN High Commissioner. We are working, I would really say, in tandem, since the EU is one of the strategic partners of the office, both politically but also financially. And we were trying and have been trying to ally also our common endeavors to commemorate these anniversaries and to use them as a tool to push back on the pushback on human rights. The EU, I mentioned one of the strategic partners of the office of the High Commissioner, also in the sense of reaffirming the independence of your office, which becomes more and more relevant. We are working together with you to try to find and build alliances, reconfirm alliances on our work for universality of human rights. This is not an easy thing to do, but I think we reflected well during the past years, I would say even, how we can do that. As to the how, we will try to reach out to new constituencies. So one thing is to continue to build these partnerships we have with civil society, with you, with these institutions we have, but also to reach out to new constituencies. And their youth is obviously one of the important pillars we have. There was a very good, I have to say, event the High Commissioner hosted yesterday evening here in Brussels, à la mairie de Bruxelles, where we included youth. We are pushing on this a lot from the side of the External Action Service, also when it comes to strategic communication, where we've been working for over a year now with youth influencers. We reached over 75 million of people engaging with us on this path to reach out and to push for universality. Let me also mention, of course, we are very much concerned about the war in Ukraine. We see this as a violation of the UN Charter by one of the P5s. It is a violation thus of international law, but also of international humanitarian law. And in this context, but not only in this context, we focus our work a lot on accountability and the fight against impunity. As two more points to mention, we've been concentrating so as to reach out to new partners and alliances much more in economic, social and cultural rights during the past 1.5 to 2 years than we did before. We want to do this in this context of this indivisibility of human rights. We are aware that we cannot only do civil and political, we need to push also on the economic, social and cultural rights. And let me add that also in the context of the last Human Rights Council session, the 53rd, where we saw some partners such as the OHCHR pushing back on a very good cooperation we had. We are aware that we need to link these two parts of the human rights. So maybe on an optimistic point, a year of opportunities, a year where we hope that by the end of the year, together with an input also from the EU, I understand the European Parliament is planning something. We will also plan a conference later this year. We will be able to give you some input, High Commissioner, and to give you pledges how to reconfirm what we have on the table, namely the OHCHR, reconfirmed by the DDPA.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks, Anje, our co-chair. And let me say, before I give the floor to Volker Türk, High Commissioner, this is the last working day for most of the colleagues here in Brussels. There is a public holiday tomorrow in Brussels, so the European Parliament is closed. Colleagues will travel on missions next week, but most probably more or less not come back to Brussels. That so many colleagues are here from different political backgrounds, from different committees, is a compliment for you and for your work, and underscores the importance of our collaboration. You have seen that colleagues raised and reflected the reports that were presented by the United Nations, which are of the essence for our political work here. Please, you have the floor. But let me also say, because the one or the other is perhaps already thinking when to leave this room, I wish you all a very best vacation time. Also in the name of Anja, I will say, get some fresh energy. And the TWA Secretariat, because they are so great people, and my team, because they are also so great people, would like to invite the guests as well as the colleagues from the various committees to raise a glass outside of the room. So there is an incentive to wait until the very end. Please, Volker, you have the floor.
Well, I definitely don't want to be an obstacle between that and the class plus much deserved holidays. Look, a couple of quick reactions to what you have mentioned. Tout d'abord, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous.
First of all, I'm very much in line with you about defending democratic and civic spaces. Civic space in the broad sense of the word. Human rights are a response to that. Article 20 of the International Pact on Civil and Political Rights includes, in paragraph 2, restrictions about hate speech and incitement to violence. I think that has to be used where disinformation is to be seen and where discourse that polarizes is used, or where there are attempts to destroy the foundations of our democracy and societies. I mean, this underpins our social contract. We have to think about how we find those things that bring us together rather than those areas where there are division, because division doesn't help, particularly when you look at the challenges that we're faced with.
We did issue this report last year, I think it was in November. We have made a number of very important recommendations. If I were to look from a broader perspective, I think it is very important whenever there is anyone doing any support to security, law enforcement type agencies to apply human rights due diligence policy when it comes to that. I mean, that's for me, we have it, by the way, in the UN. It took us a long time to develop a human rights due diligence policy in our own support that the United Nations gives in peace operations, special political missions to the security sector. Because we know how sensitive this is, especially in the type of countries where we work. I mean, not just Libya, I mean, many other countries as well. So I would encourage real thought to be given when it comes to support for security sector, in whatever way outside the EU, that you may want to think about a human rights due diligence policy. I mean, I think there are some of it that exists, but I think there could be much broader thinking about precisely that issue. On the conscientious objection to military service, it is part of the human rights framework. There are, for instance, the Committee on Civil and Political Rights has pronounced itself. We can try to find references to it. In the asylum context, someone, especially as you mentioned, if there has been a flagrant violation of the UN Charter, and if someone does not want to participate in military action against it, there is a claim to asylum. Because it would then become political persecution on account of a political opinion or membership of a particular social group. And there is, if you like, some quite well-established jurisprudence on this. Black Sea Crane Initiative. I can assure you one thing, because I've seen it when I was still with the Secretary General in New York. I mean, the Secretary General has, I think, not one single stone left unturned in order to get this deal last year. And I'm sure over the last couple of months he has done exactly the same. There are two of my colleagues, Rebecca Greenspan and Martin Griffiths, who also work hard on this. I just hope that this is a temporary setback and that the Black Sea Crane Initiative will still come together because the world needs it. And by the way, we have quite a lot of statistics on where, I don't have them with me, but I'm very happy to share it with you because I saw there was a similar question raised to our spokesperson in New York about where the crane goes. I mean, there is some that did go to high-income countries, that is correct, but there was then follow-up from that. And, you know, for the UN, for us, it was important to get the fertilizers out and to get the wheat out and the grain out because of the impact that we see. And we have done quite a lot of analysis precisely on that point, but I don't have it with me at the moment. But it's an important. But frankly, the Black Sea Crane Initiative is one that is extremely important to have revitalized as quickly as possible because it will have massive impact if we don't get it done. On diplomatie secrète, I mean, it's actually, you know, if I look at my own mandate, if I look at the mandate that was given to me 30 years ago by the General Assembly, by all 193 member states, there are lots of tensions within that mandate. Because on the one hand, it very clearly talks about putting the spotlight on emerging human rights situations, making sure that we promote and fulfill the promises of the human rights mechanisms. But it also says that I have a responsibility to engage in constructive dialogue with member states about the protection and promotion of human rights. I can tell you in the last couple of months, and this is the nature of it, of course there is a lot of work that is done behind the scenes, and that can only be done behind the scenes, especially when it comes to people who are arbitrarily detained or political prisoners. And I have usually a list of people in my pocket whenever I see a leader of a country where indeed this happens. And I can tell you, without mentioning these countries, that in a number of situations it had actually led to releases of political prisoners. And that's part of our work, it's part of our tools, it's something that is incredibly important. What I have also seen, this is, I think, a more general question, because of the polarization, the divisions and the geopolitics that we see today, there have been many countries, ever since I started, who have reached out. And it is especially countries who are caught up in the middle and in the geopolitical tensions that we have. And they want to seek a strong relationship. Even if they know that their own systems are not perfect, there are a lot of issues to be dealing with. But as always, nothing is always, it's not black and white. None of the situations are black and white. And we really need to see very carefully where are things that can happen and can happen in the right direction, where are things that absolutely are unacceptable and we need to say so, but where are things also where we can negotiate with them. And the interesting thing is, because of the tensions, countries do want this strong link with the United Nations. They want the link to the Charter. They want the link to the fundamental values, and especially the ones who want to embark on a reform process within their own countries. They want to see human rights as part of it. And one of the big challenges is precisely to push back against the notion that this is about Western values or European values. It is about universal values. And that's the big message that I have. Because if we compartmentalize, if we say it's about African values or it's about US values, we are going to lose a big battle. And it's also not historically correct. It is about fundamental human values, human rights. And the Vienna conference was incredibly important because it actually put an end to cultural relativism. It put an end to this thing that, the Universal Declaration was drafted at a time when all the countries that are now members of the United States were still colonies. Well, actually, in Vienna, it was in 1993, it was after the decolonization process, it was after the apartheid regime in South Africa fell, it was after the end of the Cold War, and it was 2 years of negotiations to achieve the declaration and the program of action. And reconfirming, revalidating, revitalizing the universal nature of the human rights regime. And that is so important. And we need to latch on to this and not have, all kinds of dialogue and narratives that actually throw dust in our eyes and make us very foggy. Well, no, there are documents that were painstakingly negotiated that we need to come back to and come back to and come back to and use in whatever we can. And it goes a bit also to the discussion. The UPR is incredibly important. It has to be peer-reviewed. It has to be with a sense of humility. I mean, sometimes I also find within the human rights community, let's be humble. We all, each and every one of us, but also if you look at the history of our countries, including in Europe, we went through hell. Let's not forget what happened in the last century. Sometimes it takes some of the things that we take for granted today were not taken for granted even 20 years ago. If I think of gender equality or LGBTIQ+. We now think that it has to happen overnight everywhere. Sometimes we have to approach it with a sense of understanding and humility that achieves exactly what we want to achieve and has the impact that we want to have, but maybe uses different methods to achieve exactly what we want to achieve. But we have to be careful about it, because I often sense, if I may be very honest and frank with you, some arrogance. And we need to be wary about it, because it's not going to open up the dialogue and the transformation that we need. You also mentioned the Iran, the fact-finding mission. And Iran more generally. As you know, I've been extremely outspoken about the situation in Iran. The fact-finding mission is now in place. They will do their first report in September. We need to be very careful about reprisals against human rights defenders. I think some of the methods that we also discussed yesterday for human rights defenders are very, very important. Whatever we can do to strengthen them is going to be critical, because human rights defenders are at the forefront. Whenever I go on an official country visit, and I've visited 13 countries ever since I started, I make a special point to meet human rights defenders, to meet victims, to meet civil society organizations before I meet the government. It works in most country situations, not always, but it's really important to do that, because it gives us a very different, it makes you feel what's happening in the country in a very different way before you engage with government officials. And that's also very, very key. So I hope that support that we get can be increased, strengthened in whatever way, because we will absolutely need it. And let's not forget, Article 14 is the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution, was very deliberately chosen as a result of not least what happened during the Second World War. And the right to political asylum is a cornerstone of the human rights framework. The fact-finding mission on Libya that you mentioned, I was very disappointed about the fact, and I'll be very open about it, that the Human Rights Council doesn't consider it anymore, which doesn't mean that there isn't an obligation on me to do it. And there are the recommendations. We have, of course, a presence in Libya itself. For us, it's critical that we continue to do the monitoring, the reporting, and the documenting, and that we, as I said, that the monitoring is also done in such a way that everyone knows what is happening in the country, and follow up on the recommendation. So the onus is probably now more on me than what the Council does, but I absolutely agree. We need to be on it, because I agree. What I have seen myself in my previous life in UNHCR, when I see how migrants and refugees and asylum seekers get treated by the Libyan authorities, it's horrendous. There's no other word for that. On food, there is actually a food security summit, I think it's this week in Rome, that looks precisely at the different aspects of it, including also the role of the private sector in all of this and the business interests. And it's precisely for that reason that, from a human rights perspective, the right to food is absolutely critical, to analyze it so that we see who benefits from price rises, from the increases in prices. What is it that we can do? And which brings me again back to this human rights economy that is critical. And the biggest ask and the biggest problem in terms of tensions that we also see is precisely related to the international financial system that we have, because it is unfair. It's no longer equitable. It doesn't deal anymore with the delivery, especially on austerity measures. If you do a human rights impact analysis of austerity measures, you would probably look at them very differently in the future. And it is really important that we look at economic systems, including fiscal policies and budget analysis, from a human rights perspective. We have invested a lot more in this, including with economists, because we also want to provide that type of analysis back to the UN system and to member states. What next on Belarus? The fact that I said what we said about that some of what is happening may amount to crimes against humanity is a very strong signal to whoever would, and the fact that we document what is happening is an important signal to prosecution around the world of precisely looking at this in much more detail. On Russia, by the way, we have about 14 commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions that work on accountability mechanisms around the world. It's the highest number we have ever had. I also hope that we can get more support on having a stronger capacity within my office to be able to deliver on the accountability mechanisms very fast. There is on the Russian Federation, the last council decided to appoint a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in the Russian Federation, and we will hear from her, I think, at the September meeting, and this is an important mandate. On humanitarian and the humanitarian needs, it is clear that the humanitarian needs outpace what is able to deliver on the budget side. But I also want to see a much stronger linkage to the human rights pillar of the United Nations, because if we invest more in some of the preventative work that we are doing, and it doesn't cost all that much money. I can tell you one particular country situation that I have in mind, 3 million country presence. We got 300 people out of detention. We had access to all detention centers in the country. We could engage in legal reform in that country. It definitely helped to decrease the repression that we saw. If we didn't have it, we would probably spend billions in humanitarian needs. And somehow, and I think it goes back to this point, how can we show that prevention actually works, which is very difficult to prove. But for me, if we don't only want to pay lip service to the human rights pillar, we also need to find adequate funding for it. And I can tell you, and I've said it publicly many times, I do think that if I look at all the things and the incredible potential that we have in the human rights framework, we probably need at least a doubling of the budget. And I'm making also the case to you. I think whatever support we can get from you on that front, I would be very, very grateful. The universality of the regime, as I think I mentioned this before, and on Myanmar, Bangladesh is incredibly important. You saw the cuts in the food rations already. That's a problem. But also when it comes to Myanmar, to Myanmar as well, we need to think about the day after, because we know that repression is not going to work. We need to look at who supports the Tatmadaw, where does the money go? And we need to find ways and means to have a bit of a strategy around precisely those issues of what can be done once the day after occurs. And I think we need to prepare for it now. Well, business and human rights, there is a declaration on business and human rights that is very important, that was adopted by the General Assembly. It's good to go back to that. There is this intergovernmental process of a working group on business and human rights, again, important to bear in mind. On the social forum, look, I understand there was only one country. It was Iran that put itself forward. It's obviously not something that is really member states, but it's nothing that where I can even influence it. It's how it is. I think you wrote already to the president of the council, and it's sometimes I wish that member states would look at these things very carefully in the future. I think that is probably. Let me just see whether there was. Well, on sanctions, just to mention sanctions. There's a lot one can say about the tools that we have, and we shouldn't only look at. We have a whole human rights machinery. Let's not forget about this. We have the UPR, we have the human rights mechanisms, we have the treaty bodies, and they are very helpful in advancing the human rights cause. Sanctions, I often see when it comes to sectoral sanctions that they have an impact on the human rights of people, and we need to be very careful about that. We need always humanitarian exemptions to it, because if we don't have them, it will affect people in a very different way. And we also need to make sure that they are applied in such a way that they don't affect the human rights of people around the world. And on migration, al-whole, I fully agree with our colleague when it comes to the return of third country nationals out of North Syria. Let's also not forget, an obligation to take them back. But also for us, when it comes to migration and refugee policies, the offer is, obviously working very closely with UNHCR, is to provide independent monitoring at the most sensitive areas where these potential violations could occur. And that's important for us because it provides feedback to all of you as well on how everyone is faring when it comes to the respect for human rights of migrants and of refugees and asylum seekers. So again, thank you very much. I know this was a bit long.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. On behalf of my co-chair and myself, I would also like to thank the interpreters that had given us overtime. And I wish also to the interpreters a really good, refreshing summer break so that we see you back after the summer break here in your extremely useful support. Volker Türk, you have addressed the rich debate that we had during the last hours here in the room, and it was a qualitative, very, very high discussion, and we thank you for your responses, but also for your frank language, because the openness of our exchange is decisive for making progress together. Our TWA committee will try and fully-hearted insist on mainstreaming human rights in all our legislative files, especially on the external affairs activities, the trade agreements, the legislative files that are still open, and we will do our foreseen missions to the Ukraine, to Ethiopia, and to Lebanon in the second half of our year 23.